My parents sabotaged my military dreams 20 years ago to trap me in a life I despised. After finding the proof of their betrayal hidden in the attic, the recruiter who once inspired me, now a high-ranking officer, became the key to my escape and their downfall. This is where the story truly begins, and you won't want to miss what happens. Make sure you're subscribed to see it through to the end. We're always curious. Where in the world are you all watching from today? Let us know in the comments. The air in my parents' attic was a familiar tapestry of dust, cedar, and time. For 38 years, it had been the silent custodian of my family's history, holding everything from my father's first set of golf clubs to the ridiculously frilly dresses my mother had insisted I wear as a child. I was only up here because my mother, Helen, had declared it was time to finally organize this chaos, which was her code for directing me to do a job she had no interest in doing herself. As vice president of operations for Hayes and Sons Realty, my life was a litany of such tasks, both professional and personal. I shifted a heavy box labeled college papers, the scent of aging cardboard filling my nostrils. My own college years felt like a lifetime ago, 4 years at the local state university, majoring in business administration. It was the sensible choice, the expected choice. The choice that had kept me right here, in this town, in this house of memories, tethered to the family business like a ship permanently moored in a placid, unmoving harbor. Beneath that box was a smaller, unassuming one with Linda High School scrawled in my mother's perfect cursive. Curiosity tugged at me. I hadn't looked through this stuff in decades. I lifted the lid and there it was, a jumble of yearbooks, corsages pressed between wax paper, and stacks of letters from friends tied with faded ribbon. At the very bottom, tucked into a corner as if hastily hidden, was a thick, pristine manila envelope. It was addressed to me, Miss Linda Hayes. The return address, printed in a crisp, official font, made my breath catch in my throat. United States Air Force Academy, Office of Admissions. My heart began a frantic, painful rhythm against my ribs. I traced the postmark with a trembling finger. May 10th, 20 years ago. I remembered that month with a clarity that defied the passage of time. It was a month of crushing disappointment, of tearful phone calls and my parents' gentle, reassuring pats on my back. "It's a long shot for anyone, sweetheart," my father had said. "Don't you worry, your future is right here with us." But this envelope, it had never been opened. The seal was unbroken. My name was typed perfectly, the address correct. It had been delivered, it had been received, and then it had been hidden. My hands shook so violently that I could barely tear the flap. It felt like a desecration, like unearthing a tomb. Inside, a heavy, embossed letterhead greeted me. My eyes scanned the words, but my brain refused to process them. I had to read the first sentence 3 times before the meaning pierced through the fog of disbelief. "Dear Ms. Hayes, on behalf of the President of the United States, it is with great pleasure that I offer you an appointment to the United States Air Force Academy, Class of." The rest of the words blurred into an incoherent stream. Appointment. Pleasure. Congratulations. Report for basic cadet training. A welcome packet was tucked behind the letter, full of checklists, uniform requirements, and a campus map. A whole life, a whole future, was detailed on those glossy pages. A future I was told I had been denied. The story my parents had told me was simple, and I had believed final. The rejection letter had arrived. It was thin, concise, and full of regret. My mother had held me as I cried, stroking my hair and whispering about how competitive it was, how I shouldn't feel bad. She said she'd thrown the letter away so I wouldn't have to look at it anymore, a small act of maternal protection. It was a lie, all of it. I sank onto a dusty old trunk, the letter clutched in my hand. The air, once thick with nostalgia, now felt suffocating, heavy with the weight of a 20-year-old deception. Every sensible choice, every decision that had led me down this safe, predictable, and deeply unfulfilling path had been orchestrated. I wasn't the one who had failed to get into the academy. My parents had failed me. They had intercepted my dream, buried it in a cardboard box, and constructed a different life for me in its place. A life they could control. I thought of my job, The endless meetings about zoning laws, the mind-numbing spreadsheets, the placating of wealthy clients. I was good at it. I was competent, efficient, and respected, and I hated every single second of it. I hated the polite smiles, the expensive suits that felt like costumes, and the heavy, gilded cage of my corner office. For years, I had believed this was my lot in life, the consequence of a single, pivotal failure in my youth. I had carried that sense of inadequacy with me for 2 decades, a quiet, persistent ache in my soul. Now I knew the truth. The ache wasn't from my failure, it was from their betrayal. I remembered the recruiter, a young Captain Corbin, who had visited my high school. He spoke of honor, of service, of a life dedicated to something larger than oneself. His words had lit a fire in me that nothing else ever had. I saw a future filled with purpose, with challenge, with flight. That fire had been systematically, deliberately extinguished by the 2 people I trusted most in the world. They hadn't just hidden a letter. They had stolen a version of me that I was never allowed to become, a woman who could have been a leader, an officer, a pilot. A woman who would have been anywhere but this dusty attic, mourning a life she never even knew she'd lost. I stood up, my legs unsteady. The box of high school memories seemed to mock me, a diorama of a life rerouted by a secret I was never meant to find. The grief was a physical force, a hollow, cavernous feeling in my chest. It was the loss of a ghost, the death of a potential that had been thriving in a parallel universe I never knew existed. I looked at the letter one more time, the embossed seal of the academy glinting in the dim light from the single attic window. The betrayal was worse than any rejection could have ever been. The drive home from my parents' house was a blur. I clutched the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white, the stolen letter tucked safely in my purse on the passenger seat. It felt like a live thing, pulsing with the energy of a life unlived. I didn't cry. The shock was too profound, a numbing agent that held the deeper, more chaotic emotions at bay. My mind was a maelstrom of images. The crisp blue of an Air Force uniform, the soaring arc of a fighter jet, the face of a younger me, full of hope and ambition. All of it felt like watching a movie about someone else's life. When I got to my sterile, modern apartment, a place I'd bought because it was a sound real estate investment, not because it felt like a home, I laid the letter and the welcome packet on my polished granite countertop. The documents looked alien in the pristine environment I'd built for myself, a relic from a past that wasn't supposed to exist. For hours, I just stared at them. I read every word, absorbing the details of a life I should have been preparing for 20 years ago. The checklist for basic cadet training, the schedule of orientation, the pamphlets on aeronautical engineering and military strategy. Around 9 o'clock, my phone rang. The caller ID flashed Mom. A wave of cold fury, sharp and sudden, washed over me, displacing the numbness. I let it ring 3 times before answering, schooling my voice into a flat, even tone. "Hello." "Linda, darling, you left so abruptly," my mother's voice chirped, smooth and perfectly modulated as always. "I was hoping you'd stay for dinner. Your father and I were just saying how we barely see you anymore." The lie was so effortless, so practiced. We had a mandatory family dinner every Sunday, and I saw them at the office 4 days a week. The guilt trip was a well-honed tool in her arsenal, designed to keep me in her orbit. "I had some things to take care of," I said, my voice betraying none of the turmoil inside me. I was a good actress. I'd had a lifetime of practice, pretending to be the dutiful daughter they'd designed. "Well, you missed a call from the Mortons about the lakefront property. I told them you'd handle it first thing in the morning. They're getting anxious, and you know how they are." She didn't ask if I was okay or why I had left. The conversation, as always, circled back to the business, to my duties, to the responsibilities that anchored me to them. "I'll call them," I said. The words felt like ash in my mouth. The Mortons and their lakefront property seemed like a problem from another planet. How could I care about commission rates and closing dates when the entire foundation of my life had just crumbled? "Good, your father is so proud of the work you're doing, you know. He was just telling me that you have a better head for contracts than he ever did. It was the classic Helen Hayes maneuver, a compliment wrapped around an expectation. A reminder of my value, which was inextricably linked to my compliance. I stared at the acceptance letter on my counter. The official seal seemed to mock her placid, controlling words. She had no idea that I held the evidence of her grandest deception in my hands. The power dynamic between us, which had felt so fixed and immutable my entire life, had just been fractured. She thought she was talking to Linda Hayes, the reliable VP of her company. She had no idea she was talking to a stranger, a woman who was just now learning the full extent of her own captivity. A Thaug. HT, cold and clear, cut through my anger. It was a whisper of an idea, a hint of a strategy. I wasn't the same naive, heartbroken 18-year-old she had so easily manipulated. I was a 38-year-old woman who had spent 2 decades mastering the art of negotiation, contracts, and leverage. I knew how to read the fine print. I knew how to find an opponent's weakness. And my parents had just revealed theirs, their desperate, suffocating need to control me. But they had forgotten one crucial thing. "Linda, are you still there?" my mother asked, a hint of impatience in her voice. "Yes, I'm here," I said, and for the first time my voice felt like my own. It was steady, resolute. "Don't worry about the Mortons. I have it under control." "I knew I could count on you, darling," she said, the satisfaction evident in her tone. She had mistaken my composure for obedience. It was a mistake she would come to regret. After we hung up, I walked back to the counter. I picked up the letter, my fingers tracing the signature of the superintendent who had signed it 20 years ago. He was long retired, I was sure. But what about Captain Corbin, the recruiter who had shaken my hand and told me I had what it takes? Where was he now? He had been so sharp, so inspiring. He was the one who planted the dream that my parents had tried to uproot. The grief was still there, a heavy stone in my gut. The loss was immense. But alongside it, something new was beginning to grow. It was a cold, hard seed of resolve. They had built my life on a lie, but they had inadvertently given me the skills to dismantle it. They had trapped me in their world of business and contracts, but that was a world I now understood better than they did. They thought they had won 2 decades ago. They were about to learn that the game wasn't over. It had just begun. To understand the depth of my parents' betrayal, you have to understand the gilded cage they had so carefully constructed. Hayes & Sons Realty wasn't just a business. It was a local institution, founded by my grandfather. It was a legacy built on handshake deals, community trust, and my father's aggressive expansion in the 90s. My parents, Robert and Helen Hayes, were pillars of the community. They were the handsome, successful couple who chaired charity galas, had a wing of the local library named after them, and always had a warm, polished smile for everyone they met. Publicly, they were perfect. Privately, their love was conditional, and the condition was always control. From a young age, my life was a curated experience. My friends were the children of their business associates. My hobbies were respectable and unimpressive: piano lessons, not soccer; debate club, not theater. Every choice was gently, inexorably guided toward the path they had laid out for me, a path that led directly to a desk in the family office. My dream of joining the Air Force was the first and only time I had ever truly rebelled. It was a wild, passionate deviation from their script. I spent months preparing for the physical fitness tests, running miles before dawn while the rest of the town was asleep. I studied relentlessly, devouring books on aviation history and military leadership. When Captain James Corbin came to my school, his crisp uniform and quiet confidence felt like a vision of the future I desperately wanted. He spoke of integrity, of pushing your limits, of serving a cause greater than your own ambition. For a girl raised on a diet of profit margins and property lines, it was like hearing a new language that my soul already understood. My parents, of course, had been politely dismissive. "It's a lovely thought, Linda, but it's a phase," my mother had said, her tone light and condescending. "A military life is so disruptive, and it's not for a young woman like you." My father was more direct. "Your place is here, Linda. This business will be yours one day. Why would you throw away a guaranteed future for a government paycheck and a chance to get posted in the middle of nowhere? They never forbade me from applying. That wasn't their style. Outright prohibition would have been too crude, too obvious. Instead, they employed a campaign of subtle sabotage. They would schedule important family dinners on the nights of my study groups. My mother would sigh dramatically about how much she was struggling with the company's quarterly reports, knowing I would feel obligated to drop everything and help her. They played the part of supportive parents on the surface, even driving me to my physical exam and interviews, all the while knowing they had no intention of ever letting me go. Their support was a performance, and I, the unwitting audience, had believed every word. The real estate office was my gilded prison. After my rejection from the academy, I had drifted into the business program at the local university with a sense of defeated resignation. My parents were thrilled. I graduated with honors and was given a starting position at Hayes & Sons. Over the next decade and a half, I climbed the ladder. I was good at my job because I had to be. I poured all the discipline and focus I had cultivated for the military into mastering real estate. I learned to negotiate with ruthless developers, to charm skeptical town councils, and to manage a team of ambitious agents. I was responsible for millions of dollars in transactions. My parents praised my success, holding me up as the perfect daughter. "Linda has a real gift for this," my father would boom to his friends at the country club. "She's a natural." It was the cruelest irony. The very skills they celebrated in me, my strategic thinking, my attention to detail, my ability to stay calm under pressure, were the same skills I would have honed as an officer in the Air Force. They had forced me into a different field, but they couldn't extinguish my essential nature. They had simply redirected it to serve their own empire. Helen, my mother, was the chief architect of my life. She was a beautiful woman, always impeccably dressed, with a smile that never quite reached her cool, calculating eyes. Her manipulation was an art form. It was in the casual way she'd mention how much she and my father were counting on me, the way she'd frame any personal desire of mine as a selfish betrayal of the family. She was a master of the emotional transaction, making me feel perpetually indebted to her for a life I never asked for. My father, Robert, was her willing accomplice. He was a classic patriarch, a man who believed in legacy and lineage above all else. He loved me, I suppose, but his love was filtered through the lens of the business. My worth was tied to my utility. He was less subtle than my mother, his disappointment more overt whenever I expressed a flicker of discontent. "Be grateful for what you have, Linda," he'd say, his voice laced with a warning. Most people would kill for this opportunity. They were a formidable team, a fortress of parental expectation. For 20 years, I had believed their narrative, that they had my best interests at heart, that their guidance was an act of love. The unopened letter in my purse had shattered that illusion. It was not love that motivated them. It was possession. They didn't want a daughter. They wanted an asset, a successor who would dutifully carry on their legacy without complaint. They had seen my dream not as a part of me to be nurtured, but as a threat to their control to be neutralized. And they had succeeded, flawlessly, for 2 decades. Until now. For 2 days after finding the letter, I went through the motions of my life in a state of suspended animation. I called the Mortons and assured them about their lakefront property. I sat through meetings, nodding and taking notes, my mind a million miles away. The grief was still there, a constant, low-grade hum beneath the surface of my composure. But with each passing hour, the cold resolve I'd felt on the phone with my mother began to solidify. Grief was a passive state. Action was the only antidote. My turning point came on the 3rd night. I was sitting in my silent apartment, the acceptance packet spread across my coffee table like a ghost's possessions. I could mourn this lost life forever, or I could find out what, if anything, was left to salvage. My parents had stolen my youth, but I would not let them steal the rest of my future. The first step was to find Captain James Corbin. A quick internet search was all it took. The young, confident captain I remembered was now Colonel James Corbin, a decorated officer serving in a high-level logistics command at the Pentagon. His official biography was impressive, listing multiple advanced degrees, distinguished service medals, and commands around the world. He was exactly the man I had expected him to become. There was a professional headshot of him, older and more serious, but with the same intelligent, focused eyes I remembered. Seeing his face, his success, didn't make me sad. It galvanized me. He was real. The path he represented was real. My dream hadn't been a childish fantasy, it had been a viable future. Finding his direct contact information was impossible, but I found the public affairs office for his command. I spent the next 2 hours drafting an email. It had to be perfect, professional, concise, and compelling enough to get past a gatekeeper and onto his desk. I couldn't sound like a rambling, nostalgic civilian. I had to sound like a peer, someone worthy of his time. Subject: inquiry from a former USAFA applicant, Linda Hayes. Dear Colonel Corbin, you will almost certainly not remember me, but 20 years ago, you visited Northwood High School as an Air Force recruiter. Your presentation on service and leadership was the primary motivation behind my application to the U.S. Air Force Academy. I was a candidate in whom you expressed a personal interest. For reasons I have only just seen to understand, I was led to believe my application was unsuccessful. I have recently discovered that I was, in fact, offered an appointment. I have the official, unopened letter in my possession. I know that at age 38, the path to becoming a cadet is long closed. I am not writing to ask for the impossible. I am writing because I have spent the last 2 decades building a career in a field I did not choose. I am the vice president of operations for a large real estate firm, where I manage complex logistics, multi-million-dollar budgets, and personnel. I have a proven track record in strategic planning and execution, skills that, ironically, I had hoped to one day use in service to the Air Force. My question is simple. Is there any path at all for someone with my professional background to serve? I am not looking to recapture a lost dream, but to build a new one on a foundation of experience. Thank you for your time and for your long and distinguished service. Sincerely, Linda Hayes. I read it over a dozen times before hitting send. The moment it was gone, a sliver of the old, youthful hope I thought had died forever flickered back to life. It was a long shot, but it was a shot I was finally taking for myself. The next morning, I went to the office with a new sense of purpose. While my computer booted up, I pulled out my employment contract from my personal files. I had negotiated it myself 5 years ago during a formal restructuring of the company. My father had been impressed, calling my terms sharp. I had insisted on a clear and punitive buyout clause for my shares in the company, framing it as a way to protect my stake in the legacy. If I were to ever leave the company for any reason, the parent company, owned by my mother and father, was legally obligated to buy out my 20% share at the current market valuation. At the time, I'd seen it as a smart business move. Now I saw it for what it was, my escape plan. I spent the next hour running a preliminary valuation of the company based on the last 2 years of earnings. The number was staggering. My 20% stake was worth a small fortune, more than enough to fund a complete life change. The buyout would be a massive financial blow to Hayes and Sons, likely forcing my parents to liquidate other assets or take on significant debt. Their prison, which they had built to keep me in, had a very expensive exit door. The sharp contract my father had praised was about to become the instrument of my liberation. The knowledge was intoxicating. This wasn't about revenge in the petty sense. It was about justice. It was about reclaiming the value of the 20 years of my life and labor they had co-opted for their own benefit. They had made my life about money and business. It was only fitting that I would use the language of money and business to buy my freedom. The trap was set. Now, all I had to do was wait for the right moment to spring it. A week passed. It was the longest week of my life. Every ping from my inbox sent a jolt of anxiety and hope through me. I continued my work at Hayes and Sons, a silent observer in my own life, watching my parents operate with the casual authority of people who believe they are untouchable. Their confidence in my loyalty, in my permanent place within their universe, was absolute. It was almost pitiable. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon, an email arrived. The subject line was simple: Ray, inquiry from a former USAFA applicant. The sender was a major assigned to Colonel Corbin's office. My heart hammered against my ribs as I opened it. The major informed me that Colonel Corbin did, in fact, remember my name and my application. He had been impressed with my email and was willing to schedule a 15-minute video call to discuss potential avenues of service. I felt a surge of triumph so pure it almost brought me to tears. He remembered me. After 20 years and thousands of candidates, he remembered me. That single fact was a powerful validation, a confirmation that the potential he had seen in me hadn't been a figment of my imagination. The call was scheduled for Friday. I had 3 days to prepare. I spent my evenings researching civilian officer roles within the Department of the Air Force, focusing on logistics and acquisitions, fields where my corporate experience would be a direct asset. I was no longer a grieving daughter. I was a candidate preparing for the most important interview of my life. When I logged onto the video call, I was struck by how little Colonel Corbin had changed. The lines on his face were deeper. His hair was graying at the temples, but his posture was ramrod straight, and his eyes had the same incisive intensity I remembered. "Ms. Hayes," he began, his voice a calm, authoritative baritone. "It's good to finally speak with you after all these years. I'll be direct. I remember your file distinctly. You were an exceptional candidate. Top of your class, outstanding physical score. Ease and an interview that left a lasting impression. When your name never appeared on the final matriculation roster, I was genuinely surprised." Hearing those words from him, the man who represented the starting point of my stolen dream, was like a dam breaking. "I was told I was rejected," I said, my voice thick with emotion I couldn't hide. "I only found out the truth last week." He nodded slowly, a look of profound understanding on his face. He didn't press for details, for which I was grateful. He simply said, "Some things are not ours to understand. The question is what we do now. Your email was one of the most compelling I've received in a long time. You were right to contact me." For the next 15 minutes, which stretched to nearly 45, we spoke about my career. I laid out my experience in operations, budget management, and strategic planning. He listened intently, asking sharp, insightful questions. He wasn't just being polite, he was assessing me. "Your skills are not just applicable, Linda," he said, using my first name for the first time. "They are in high demand. We have civilian leadership positions in the Air Force Materiel Command that are incredibly difficult to fill. These are GS-14 and GS-15 level roles, senior positions for professionals with extensive private sector experience. It's a rigorous application process, but from what you've told me, you are precisely the kind of candidate they look for." He gave me the name of a specific program and a direct contact in the civilian personnel office. He offered to write a letter of recommendation to accompany my application. He gave me a concrete, actionable plan. A door I thought had been permanently welded shut 20 years ago had just been opened. When the call ended, I sat in silence, overwhelmed with a sense of possibility I hadn't felt since I was a teenager. Colonel Corbin had given me more than just information. He had given me back a piece of my own identity. He saw me not as a dutiful daughter or a real estate VP, but as a leader with potential. That evening, armed with this newfound validation, I decided to test the waters. My mother called, as she always did, to check in, her euphemism for issuing directives. After we discussed the usual business matters, I kept her on the line. "Mom," I said, my tone deliberately casual. "I was up in the attic the other day, going through some old boxes from high school. It's funny the things you forget about." "Oh," she said, her voice neutral, but I could picture her senses sharpening, her internal radar activating. "Yeah, I was thinking about that spring, right before graduation. I was so nervous, waiting to hear back from the academy. You and Dad were so good about checking the mail for me every day when I was at track practice. There was a fractional pause on the other end of the line. It was barely a second, but in that silent beat, I heard everything. I heard the frantic search of her memory, the flicker of alarm. "Well, of course, darling," she said, her voice recovering its smooth maternal cadence. "We knew how much it meant to you. It was such a shame it didn't work out." The lie was so practiced, so reflexive, she didn't even hesitate. "It was," I said, letting the words hang in the air. "I was just wondering, do you remember what the rejection letter looked like? Was it a small envelope or a large one?" The silence this time was longer. I had introduced a specific, unexpected detail. Her mind was now racing, trying to calculate the angle, to sniff out the trap. "Linda, for heaven's sake, that was 20 years ago," she said, her voice taking on a sharp, dismissive edge. "Why on earth would you be dwelling on that now? You have a wonderful career. You should be focused on the future, not on some silly high school disappointment." It was a classic deflection, an attempt to reframe my valid question as childish and irrational. It was the confirmation I needed. She was nervous. She was hiding something. "You're right, Mom," I said, my voice now as cool and calm as hers always was. "I should be focused on the future." I ended the call, a grim sense of satisfaction settling over me. The first shot had been fired. She had no idea what was coming, but she knew something had changed. The fear I had heard in her voice was the beginning of her downfall. My mother's instincts, honed by decades of careful manipulation, were sharp. She knew something was amiss. In the days following our phone call, her behavior shifted. The subtle control became overt. She began micromanaging my work, questioning my decisions on accounts I had handled independently for years. She'd call me into her office for chats that were thinly veiled interrogations about my mood, my social life, and my sudden interest in the past. "I'm just worried about you, darling," she'd say, her face a mask of maternal concern. "You seem distant. Is everything all right?" Each question was a probe, an attempt to gauge what I knew. My father, likely at her urging, adopted a strategy of paternal disappointment. He'd sigh heavily in meetings whenever I spoke, or make comments about how my focus seemed to be slipping. They were trying to box me in, to use their old tactics of guilt and pressure to force me back into my designated role. But their tactics no longer worked. I wasn't the insecure girl they had raised. I was a woman with a plan. While they were escalating their psychological warfare, I was building my case and my escape route. I contacted a corporate lawyer, an old classmate from university who had a reputation for being discreet and fiercely intelligent. I explained my situation, laying out the details of my employment contract and my intention to exercise the buyout clause. "This is airtight, Linda," she said after reviewing the documents. "They signed it. They're legally bound to buy you out at fair market value. It will be painful for them, but it's non-negotiable." Together, we prepared the formal legal notice. Having the papers drawn up and ready to serve was a powerful feeling. It was a tangible symbol of my impending freedom. Simultaneously, I threw myself into the application process for the civilian position Colonel Corbin had recommended. It was an exhaustive undertaking, requiring detailed essays, professional references, and a complete accounting of my career. I spent my nights and weekends crafting my application, pouring all the focus and dedication I had once reserved for Hayes and Sons into this new endeavor. Colonel Corbin was true to his word, sending a powerful letter of recommendation directly to the review board on my behalf. Each step I took in this new direction felt like I was reclaiming a part of my soul. I was no longer just reacting to my parents' betrayal. I was proactively building my own future. The final piece of irrefutable proof I needed came from an unexpected source. One rainy Saturday, I was searching for an old tax document in my apartment storage unit. In a box of my own college mementos, I found a stack of old journals. I sat on the cold concrete floor and flipped through the one from my senior year of high school. My younger self leaped from the pages, her voice full of hopes, fears, and dreams. And then I found the entries from that fateful May. May 5th had my last follow-up interview today. Captain Corbin was there and he wished me luck. I feel like I have a real shot. I can't imagine anything else I want to do with my life. May 8th, getting so antsy waiting. Mom and Dad promised they would watch the mailbox for me every afternoon while I'm at track practice, so I don't miss it. They said they're excited for me, but sometimes I feel like they're just pretending. May 12th, the letter came today, a small one. I didn't get in. Mom held me while I cried for an hour. She said it was for the best, that my real future was here at home. I feel so empty. I guess they were right all along. Reading those words, written in my own youthful scrawl, was like a punch to the gut. The casual mention of my parents' promise to watch the mail was the missing link. It wasn't just a crime of omission, of hiding a letter that had arrived. It was an act of premeditated deception. They had actively volunteered to be the gatekeepers of my dream, knowing all along they intended to crush it. The entry was dated 2 days after the postmark on the acceptance letter. They had received it, hidden it, and then lied directly to my face, staging a scene of comfort and sympathy over a tragedy they themselves had authored. Any lingering flicker of doubt, any thought that perhaps it had been a misunderstanding, was extinguished. This journal entry was my personal, undeniable proof. It broke the last emotional chain that bound me to their narrative. My grief transformed into a cold, hard certainty. There was no room for reconciliation, no possibility of forgiveness, not until they faced the full consequences of their actions. My strategy was now complete. I had the legal leverage with the buyout clause. I had the professional path forward with the Air Force application. And I had the emotional armor provided by the truth, memorialized in my own handwriting. My parents thought they were escalating the stakes by increasing the pressure on me at work. They had no idea that I was the one holding all the cards, preparing for a final confrontation that would not just end my career with them, but would fundamentally dismantle the empire of control they had spent a lifetime building. The occasion for the final act of my old life was the 50th anniversary gala for Hayes & Sons Realty. It was the kind of event my mother lived for, a grand affair held at the most exclusive country club in town, attended by every local bigwig, from the mayor to the bank presidents who financed our biggest deals. It was a night to celebrate the Hayes legacy, a carefully orchestrated performance of success and unity. My parents were at the center of it all, radiant and confident, accepting congratulations and basking in the spotlight. For them, I was a key part of the scenery, the dutiful daughter and heir apparent, a testament to their successful parenting. I played my part perfectly throughout the cocktail hour and dinner. I wore an elegant, understated navy blue dress, the picture of corporate sophistication. I smiled, shook hands, and made small talk about the booming real estate market. I watched my parents as they moved through the crowd, my mother's tinkling laugh echoing across the ballroom, my father's hand clasped on the shoulders of his associates. They looked so proud, so secure in their world. They had no idea it was all about to come crashing down. After dessert, my father took to the podium to give the keynote speech. He spoke of my grandfather's humble beginnings, of his own hard work, and of the bright future of the company. At the end, as expected, he turned his attention to me. And none of this would be possible without the next generation, he announced, beaming in my direction. My daughter, Linda, she has been the driving force behind our recent expansion, a brilliant strategist and the future of Hayes & Sons. Linda, please come up and say a few words. A warm, polite applause filled the room. All eyes turned to me. This was it. This was the moment I had been planning for. My mother's smile was one of pure, proprietary pride. She believed this was her ultimate triumph, her daughter, on stage, affirming the life she had chosen for her. I walked to the podium, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. I felt preternaturally calm. I adjusted the microphone and looked out at the sea of familiar faces. "Thank you, Dad," I began, my voice clear and even. "Thank you all for being here to celebrate 50 years of Hayes & Sons. My father is right. It's a legacy built on hard work and strategic choices. I paused, letting my eyes sweep the room before they landed on my parents, who were seated at the head table. Tonight, I want to talk about a strategic choice that was made on my behalf 20 years ago. A ripple of confusion went through the audience. My father's smile faltered. My mother's expression tightened. Many of you know me as a real estate executive, I continued, my voice never wavering. But when I was 17, I had a different dream. I wanted to serve my country. I wanted to be an officer in the United States Air Force. I applied to the academy, and I put everything I had into that application. I reached into the small clutch I was carrying and pulled out a thick, yellowed manila envelope. I held it up for everyone to see. I was told I was rejected, I said, my voice ringing with a clarity that cut through the silence of the ballroom. I was told the letter that arrived was a thin one, full of regret. For 20 years, I lived with the consequences of that supposed failure. I built a life I was told I should want. But a few weeks ago, while cleaning out an old box, I found this. I tore open the seal, the sound echoing in the hushed room. I pulled out the crisp, embossed letter. This is my letter of appointment to the United States Air Force Academy. It's dated May 10th, 20 years ago. It seems there was a clerical error. It was delivered to my parents, but it was never delivered to me. A collective gasp went through the room. I looked directly at my mother and father. My father's face was ashen, his mouth slightly agape. My mother's face was a frozen mask of horror, her eyes wide with disbelief and panic. The pillars of the community were crumbling before a captive audience. The choice to hide this letter, I said, my voice dropping to a serious, deliberate tone, was a strategic one. It was made to keep me here, to ensure the family business had a successor. It was a choice that guaranteed my presence, but it came at the cost of my purpose. I folded the letter and placed it gently on the podium. Therefore, I am here tonight to make a choice of my own. Effective immediately, I am resigning from my position as Vice President of Hayes & Sons Realty. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. My father started to rise from his chair, but I held up a hand. I have one last piece of business to attend to, I said. I nodded toward the ballroom doors. As if on cue, my lawyer, a sharp woman in a dark suit, entered and walked purposefully toward the head table. As per the terms of my employment contract, which my father himself praised as being very sharp, I am exercising the mandatory buyout clause for my 20% share in the company. My lawyer has the formal notice for you. She placed the legal document directly in front of my father. He stared at it as if it were a snake. My mother looked from the document to me, her eyes finally shedding their shock and filling with a venomous rage. The public humiliation was more than she could bear. And finally, I said, turning back to the audience, I am proud to announce that I have accepted a senior civilian leadership position with the Department of the Air Force in the Air Force Materiel Command. It turns out it's never too late to serve. It's never too late to choose your own life. I looked at my parents one last time. Their legacy, their reputation, their carefully crafted image, all of it was shattered, lying in pieces on the floor of the ballroom. I had not raised my voice. I had not wept. I had simply told the truth. Thank you, I concluded, stepping away from the podium. I walked off the stage, past the stunned faces of the guests, and didn't look back. I could hear the chaos beginning to unfold behind me, but it was no longer my concern. I walked out of the country club and into the cool night air, a free woman. The fallout from the gala was immediate and catastrophic for my parents. News in a town our size travels with the speed of wildfire. By the next morning, the story of my public resignation and the reasons behind it were the talk of every coffee shop and boardroom. The carefully polished image of the perfect Hayes family was irrevocably tarnished. Their friends and business associates, the very people they had sought to impress, now looked at them with a mixture of pity and contempt. The financial blow was just as severe. As my lawyer had predicted, the buyout clause was ironclad. My parents, attorneys, fought it for a week before conceding they had no legal standing. To buy out my shares at their full market value, They were forced to take out a massive business loan, leveraging several of their prime commercial properties. The debt crippled the company's cash flow, halting the expansion projects I had once managed. Hayes and Sons Realty, the empire they had sacrificed my happiness to protect, was now a wounded beast, saddled with debt and a disgraced reputation. My mother, predictably, tried to retaliate. I received a string of voicemails that devolved from saccharine pleas for a private conversation to clear up this misunderstanding to furious, venomous rants accusing me of being ungrateful and cruel. I didn't listen to them fully. I saved them, then deleted them. My father remained silent. His shame was apparently so profound that he couldn't even bring himself to speak to me. I ignored it all. I was too busy building my new life. I sold my sterile apartment, packed my belongings, and moved to Ohio, near Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where my new position was located. The process of starting over was both daunting and exhilarating. I was no longer a big fish in a small pond. I was a new civil servant in a vast, complex organization. My first day on the job was surreal. I walked the halls of a building where uniformed officers and dedicated civilians worked together on projects of national importance. The work was challenging, dealing with global supply chains and billion-dollar budgets for cutting-edge technology. It was infinitely more complex and meaningful than any real estate deal I had ever brokered. I was using my skills not to enrich my family, but to support the men and women of the Air Force. For the first time in my adult life, my work felt like it mattered. Colonel Corbin became a mentor and a friend. He checked in on me periodically, offering guidance and encouragement. "You always belonged here, Linda," he told me during one of our calls. "You just took the scenic route." His validation was a quiet, steadying presence as I navigated my new world. About a year after I left, I received a stilted, formal letter from my father. It was a single page. He didn't apologize for the betrayal, but he did acknowledge it. He wrote that my mother had been unable to cope with the public scandal and had withdrawn from all her social duties. The business was struggling, and he was considering selling it. At the end of the letter, he wrote a sentence that was as close to an apology as he would likely ever get. "I have come to realize that a legacy is worthless if you destroy your family to build it." I read the letter, folded it, and put it away. It didn't stir any desire for reconciliation. The wound was too deep, the deception too profound. I could not forget the 20 years they had stolen. But the burning anger had faded, replaced by a quiet, settled peace. Their fate was no longer tied to mine. Their struggles were the consequences of their own choices, and I felt a detached sort of pity for them, trapped in the ruins of the life they had valued so highly. My own life was just beginning. One crisp autumn afternoon, I stood on the edge of the flight line at the base, watching F-15s practice takeoffs. The roar of the jet engines was a deafening, beautiful sound, the sound of power, of freedom, of purpose. I thought of the 18-year-old girl who had dreamed of this sky, who had believed her dream was impossible. I wished I could tell her that her story wasn't over, that her strength and discipline would not go to waste. I may never wear the uniform or pilot a jet, but I was serving. I was exactly where I was meant to be. I had lost one life, but the one I had built in its place was my own. And as I watched the jets climb until they were just specks in the vast, blue expanse, I felt a sense of belonging that no corner office or bank account could ever provide. I was finally home.